Hey everyone, welcome to Chronicles of Sleep. Today we're diving into the unbelievable true story of Karl Koecher, the only man known to have infiltrated the CIA from the inside while secretly serving the KGB. A playboy, a double agent, and a pawn in one of the Cold War's most dramatic spy swaps. His life reads like a thriller, but every moment was real. Before we get started, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dive documentaries into espionage, betrayal, and covert history. And let us know in the comments, what's the most shocking spy story you've ever come across? Let's dive in. Karl Koecher was a man who should never have been able to pull it off. To sit inside the very nerve center of America's Cold War intelligence machine, to have access to the deepest files of the CIA, to handle reports stamped with the words top secret, to brush shoulders with officers who lived and died by the code of silence, and yet, all the while, to funnel the secrets of that empire back across the Atlantic to a drab, gray office in Prague. His story begins not with an abrupt moment of betrayal, but with a life shaped by the shadows of war, politics, and an almost reckless confidence in his own ability to play roles, to manipulate, to seduce. The question of how a Czech-born man in his early 30s managed to place himself inside the CIA reads like a thriller written by a master of suspense. Yet, in reality, it unfolded in slow, deliberate moves, set against the backdrop of one of the tensest eras in modern history, the Cold War. He had been born in 1934 in Bratislava, a time when Europe was a patchwork of fragile states and rising dictatorships. The Second World War would define his earliest memories, leaving behind ruins, scarcity, and a childhood colored by propaganda, tension, and political upheaval. For Karl, survival was about adaptation. He learned quickly to read people, to gauge their desires, to figure out how far he could push before trust snapped or suspicion set in. His intellect was keen, his presence magnetic. He could be charming in one moment, cutting in another, depending on what the moment required. By the time he was a teenager, he had internalized the lessons of a continent split by ideology. To thrive, one had to hide convictions, wear masks, and speak in tones others expected to hear. In Czechoslovakia, after the war, the Communist Party was ascendant, carving the nation into a satellite state under Soviet oversight. For young men of Karl's generation, there was little room for dissent. To get ahead, you needed to either conform or master the art of appearing to conform. However, Karl chose the latter. He pursued higher education, where his sharp mind and facility with languages became obvious. He studied philosophy and literature, disciplines that honed his ability to argue, to reshape narratives, to inhabit multiple viewpoints at once. These were not just academic pursuits, they were weapons in the making. He discovered he could charm professors, impress intellectual circles, and debate politics with subtlety, even when his true thoughts diverged from the official line. It was during these years that his attraction to the gray area of truth took root. He enjoyed the game of concealment, the thrill of knowing more than those around him, of being able to manipulate perspectives while appearing earnest. It was, in essence, the mindset of a spy before he ever carried the title. The Statní bezpečnost, the STB, Czechoslovakia's intelligence service, was always watching for recruits of this kind. Bright, adaptable, fluent in foreign tongues, comfortable in the world of ideas, but ambitious enough to want more. The Cold War was heating up, and the battle for supremacy demanded not just soldiers and tanks, but spies who could penetrate the inner workings of the enemy. The United States was the prize target, and within the United States no prize was greater than the CIA. To place a man inside it would be an achievement of staggering proportions. And so, when Karl came to their attention, the STB saw possibility. He was not a man driven by ideology. He was not some fervent believer in the righteousness of socialism. Instead, he was pragmatic, calculating, and vain. But he was also fearless, and to intelligence officers, that kind of profile could be shaped into something powerful. Before he was formally approached, Karl lived the life of an academic dissident in miniature. He disliked the suffocating orthodoxy of the communist regime, but he never showed that dislike openly. Instead, he cultivated an aura of intellectual aloofness. He married a woman named Hannah, a striking figure in her own right, who shared his taste for excitement and danger. Together they formed a couple that seemed destined to live above the ordinary. They were not content to sit quietly in Prague, resigned to dull jobs and lifeless evenings. They wanted glamour, adventure, and recognition. For Karl, the route to that future would run straight through duplicity. The Steebies' recruitment of him was careful, methodical. They tested his willingness, dangled opportunities, and gauged how far he could be pushed into morally ambiguous territory. The young man did not flinch. If anything, he leaned in. The idea of playing a role appealed to him deeply. Espionage was theater of the highest stakes, and Karl relished the stage. The handlers saw it in his eyes, the hunger, the excitement. He was not merely willing to work for them, he was eager. This eagerness made him dangerous, but also valuable. With training, with patience, he could be molded into something few dared to imagine, a mole inside America's Central Intelligence apparatus. But how could such a man possibly get there? The United States was not in the habit of admitting Eastern Europeans with ties to communist regimes into the heart of its intelligence networks. The STB understood this, and so they devised a plan. Karl and Hannah would emigrate, ostensibly defecting from Czechoslovakia, appearing to leave the Eastern Bloc behind. They would play the part of intellectual refugees, fleeing the suffocating oppression of socialism in search of freedom and opportunity in the West. The narrative was perfect. A young, brilliant philosopher, disgusted with communist dogma, seeking a life where his talents could flourish without censorship. For American audiences in the early 1960s, it was irresistible. Karl was poised to become the embodiment of Cold War propaganda, a defector who validated everything the West wanted to believe about the superiority of democracy. And behind that mask, he would begin his slow, calculated climb into the CIA. When Karl and Hannah arrived in the United States in the mid-1960s, they brought with them the aura of sophisticated intellectuals. Karl pursued graduate studies, embedding himself in academia, where his fluency in English and his European sensibility made him stand out. Hannah, equally charismatic, built her own reputation in social circles. Together, they were exotic, intriguing, the kind of couple who turned heads at gatherings. Their lives were carefully curated to appear both authentic and aspirational. They embraced the freedoms of the West with gusto, attending parties, experimenting with the cultural shifts of the era, mingling with artists, intellectuals, and eventually professionals with ties to government. Karl's natural charm, amplified by his foreign mystique, smoothed his path. It was during this time that Karl carefully constructed the persona that would open doors for him in the world of intelligence. He presented himself as an ardent anti-communist, the kind of man who had seen firsthand the failings of socialism and had the scars to prove it. He spoke bitterly of censorship, of ideological suffocation, of the fear that haunted intellectual life in Czechoslovakia. He sounded credible because in many ways it was true. He had lived under the regime. He knew its inner workings. What he left unsaid, of course, was that his ties to that regime had never truly been severed. He was still reporting back to Prague, still cultivating his role as an asset. The Americans, eager for defectors who could provide insight into the Eastern Bloc, found him compelling. He appeared to them as both useful and trustworthy. The CIA in those years was expanding, searching for people with linguistic skills, with cultural knowledge, with the ability to penetrate the minds of America's adversaries. Karl, with his background, fit the bill. Slowly, steadily, he began to move closer to the intelligence community. He secured opportunities, networked, impressed those who mattered. And then, in the early 1970s, the improbable happened. Karl Koecher was brought into the CIA as a translator and analyst. The man who had been recruited years earlier in Prague by the STB now sat behind a desk in Langley, with access to some of the most sensitive information in the Cold War. It was a triumph almost too good to be believed. For the STB, for the Soviets with whom they shared intelligence, it was as if lightning had struck. Koecher began feeding them classified reports, the kind of documents that outlined not just American thinking, but the very mechanics of its operations. From Langley, he could see into the soul of U.S. intelligence, and from Prague, they could peer out with his eyes. The information he supplied was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was technical, sometimes bureaucratic, but collectively it built a picture of how the CIA thought, how it worked, where it was strong, and where it was vulnerable. It was gold. And yet, what made Karl remarkable was not just his access, but his attitude. He did not act like a man crushed by the weight of betrayal. He reveled in it. Outside of the office, he lived flamboyantly. He and Hanna became notorious in certain circles for their libertine lifestyle, hosting gatherings that blurred the line between social and sexual adventure. They were swingers, thrill-seekers, people who delighted in the taboo. To their friends, they were simply unconventional intellectuals enjoying the freedoms of the West. To the intelligence services watching from afar, it was evidence of Karl's reckless confidence. He believed he could get away with anything, that no mask would slip, no cover would falter. He was a man intoxicated by the game. But games, especially in espionage, always carry risk. The more Karl lived loudly, the greater the chance that someone would begin to question who he really was. Inside the CIA, whispers eventually began to surface. His politics, his lifestyle, his arrogance. They stood out in ways that did not sit comfortably with everyone. Yet, for years he managed to evade serious scrutiny. He was too useful, too well-placed, too charming. The Americans wanted to believe in him, and so they did. But the clock was ticking. Every secret he passed on was a thread in a web that would one day tighten around him. The story of Karl Koecher is not just the tale of a spy. It is the tale of a man who thrived in the spaces between truth and performance, who turned his marriage into a partnership in espionage, who treated ideology as a costume rather than a conviction. It is the story of how, in the theater of the Cold War, one man managed to walk onto the CIA's stage, not as a spectator, but as an actor in disguise. And it is the story of how that disguise, once flawless, would begin to crack under the relentless pressure of suspicion, surveillance, and the very arrogance that had carried him so far. For now, though, in the early chapters of his journey, Karl Koecher was untouchable. The boy from Bratislava, the intellectual from Prague, the émigré who had fled communism, was living the dream of every Cold War double agent, admired in America, trusted in Langley, and celebrated in secret back in Prague. The STB had gambled on his hunger for adventure, and that gamble was paying off beyond imagination. Karl believed himself to be the master of the game, a man playing both sides without consequence. But the Cold War had a way of catching up with even its most daring players, and beneath the glamour, beneath the bravado, the clock on Karl Koecher's double life was already ticking down. Karl Koecher entered the CIA not with the nervousness of a man aware of his deception, but with the calm assurance of an actor walking onto a stage where he already knew the script. For others, the corridors of Langley represented awe, the hum of machines processing intelligence from around the globe, the whispers of analysts decoding the hidden strategies of adversaries, the hushed confidence of officers who had earned their clearance through years of service. For Karl, it was something else entirely. Every door he passed, every file he touched, every colleague who greeted him with casual trust represented a victory for the cause he secretly served. He was an imposter in plain sight, his mask so convincingly affixed that no one questioned its authenticity. He began modestly. His first assignments were translations, the tedious but essential work of rendering raw intelligence from one language into another. It was not glamorous, and for most newcomers it was the kind of work that dulled ambition. But Karl was different. His facility with languages made him quick and efficient, and his interest in the subtleties of phrasing meant he often caught nuances that others might miss. In staff meetings, he spoke with confidence, offering interpretations of meaning that impressed superiors. He seemed to be exactly what they needed: a defector from the Eastern Bloc, someone who knew the rhythms of Slavic languages and the political undertones of their use. The fact that he had lived under communism gave his insights an edge of authenticity. He could explain not just what was written, but why it was written that way, what cultural assumptions lay beneath it, and how it might reveal the intentions of those behind the words. Behind his calm demeanor, however, every piece of paper he touched was an opportunity. The STB handlers who had placed him on this path wanted access to the inner workings of the CIA, and Karl delivered. Sometimes it was documents copied word for word. Other times it was summaries whispered in coded language during clandestine meetings. He began to pass along information that painted a picture of the CIA's methods, how analysts were trained to think, how priorities were assigned, what the Americans worried about most. To Prague, and by extension to Moscow, this was priceless. The information might not have been explosive in isolation, but cumulatively it revealed a portrait of the American intelligence machine that was otherwise unreachable. Karl developed a rhythm. By day, he was the diligent analyst, translating and reviewing, smiling at colleagues, taking coffee breaks, slipping into the rhythms of bureaucratic life. By night, he and Hannah lived their other life, the life that fed their hunger for excitement. Their apartment became a stage of its own: wine, conversation, music, laughter that often blurred into seduction. They cultivated an image of cosmopolitan Europeans, unafraid of taboos, reveling in the freedoms of America. Their social circles grew, and with them the opportunities to gather gossip, to network, to position themselves as worldly figures with connections that reached beyond the ordinary. Inside the CIA, Karl was climbing slowly but steadily. Promotions were careful, but his work earned recognition. The more access he gained, the more valuable his reports to Prague became. He began handling cables that revealed the CIA's understanding of Soviet operations, summaries of intelligence shared by allies, outlines of plans for counterintelligence. He could see in real time how the United States viewed the Eastern Bloc. And with each secret that crossed his desk, Karl felt the surge of triumph. He was not just surviving, he was excelling. The irony of it all was that his colleagues never suspected. To them, Karl was one of those rare defectors who had made good. His accent and demeanor added a touch of exoticism, but it was wrapped in the convincing narrative of a man who had fled tyranny for freedom. He told stories of life in Czechoslovakia, of censorship and fear, of the crushing monotony of socialist rule. These tales reinforced the belief that he was grateful to be in the West, that he had no love for the regime he had left behind. In reality, he remained tethered to that regime by invisible strings he played like a violin. But Karl's life was not without risk. Espionage is never a straight path, and the very access that gave him power also placed him under the subtle but constant scrutiny of those around him. In meetings, he sometimes spoke too confidently, too bluntly, as though he knew more than he should. His arrogance, an essential part of his personality, occasionally raised eyebrows. Some colleagues found him charming, others found him unsettling. But in the world of intelligence, where eccentricity was not uncommon, Karl's quirks were tolerated. After all, he was delivering results, and in an agency that valued outcomes, this was often enough. The STB encouraged him to be bold, to press as far as he could without tipping suspicion. They wanted to know not just the CIA's secrets, but the culture of the organization, the mindset of its officers, the very psychology of American intelligence. Karl obliged. He reported not just on documents, but on conversations, attitudes, and rumors. He became, in effect, a sociologist of Langley, dissecting its inner life for his masters in Prague. It was this dimension of his work that made him invaluable. Spies can steal papers, but few can capture the soul of an organization. Karl, with his philosopher's training and his keen intuition, could. And yet, for all his triumphs, cracks began to appear, small at first but destined to widen. His flamboyant lifestyle with Hana, while exhilarating, made him conspicuous. They were known for their parties, their willingness to push boundaries, their participation in the underground world of swinging. To most who encountered them, this was merely eccentricity, a product of the liberal America of the 1970s. But to those who looked more closely, it was a question mark. Was this the behavior of a dedicated anti-communist intellectual, or was there something else at play? Karl did not seem to care. If anything, the risk thrilled him. The more secrets he stole by day, the more recklessly he lived by night. It was as though he believed that his masks were so convincing, his performances so flawless, that he was untouchable. This arrogance was both his strength and his weakness. It allowed him to operate without hesitation, but it also blinded him to the possibility that others might be watching more carefully than he realized. Inside Langley, the CIA was constantly reevaluating its own security. The Cold War was an era of moles and betrayals, and suspicion was an occupational hazard. Counterintelligence officers were trained to look for anomalies, for signs that someone might not be what they appeared to be. For years, Karl evaded their gaze, slipping beneath the radar of suspicion. But gradually, fragments of unease began to gather. Why was this émigré so bold in his politics? Why did he seem so comfortable, so certain, in environments where others were cautious? Why did whispers of his private life, passed around in gossip, seem so out of sync with the image of a man supposedly grateful for sanctuary? Still, these were only whispers, not accusations. For the moment, Karl remained secure. He continued to feed Prague a steady stream of intelligence, building a reputation as one of the most successful infiltrations in the history of the Eastern Bloc. The STB praised him, rewarded him, relied on him. Moscow, too, took notice, recognizing the extraordinary value of a man inside the CIA's walls. Karl, however, was not content to be merely a conduit. He enjoyed shaping perceptions, manipulating the flow of information. Sometimes he would emphasize certain details, downplay others, steering the picture his handlers received. It was not just about loyalty. It was about control. He relished being the man at the center of two worlds, a double agent who could pull the strings of both sides. But espionage, like theater, depends on timing. Too much improvisation, too much arrogance, and the illusion falters. For Karl Koecher, the years inside the CIA were a high-wire act performed without a net. Each day was another step across the rope. Each secret passed another gust of wind threatening his balance. He believed he could walk it indefinitely, that the applause of his handlers and the trust of his colleagues would never collide. But the Cold War was merciless, and the walls of Langley, though slow to react, had ears. For now, Karl remained in place, his mask intact, his access undisturbed. But the unease was growing. Somewhere in the vast machinery of American counterintelligence, the first glimmers of doubt about him were beginning to flicker. And when doubt takes hold in that world, it does not fade. It grows quietly, patiently, until it erupts into suspicion, investigation, and the deadly dance of exposure. Karl, ever confident, continued to play his roles. To his colleagues, he was the sharp émigré intellectual who had fled communism. To his handlers, he was the golden mole, delivering America's secrets. To Hana, he was the partner in a dangerous game of seduction and deception. But beneath all these masks was a man increasingly convinced of his own invincibility, a conviction that would, in time, collide with reality in ways he could not yet imagine. Karl Koecher's life in America had always been a performance, but by the mid-1970s, the stage on which he played grew more elaborate and dangerous. By day, he was the quiet insider at Langley, parsing documents, weighing intelligence, and delivering polished analyses that slipped neatly into the bureaucratic machinery of the CIA. By night, however, he and his wife Hana were weaving themselves into a very different tapestry of Washington life. A tapestry of parties, whispers, and seduction, one that would come to define his legend as much as the secrets he passed across the Atlantic. The contradictions of his existence were glaring, yet somehow he made them blend together. It was precisely this blending that gave his double life its power and its peril. Karl had always thrived on control. To manipulate words in a translation was one thing, but to manipulate people, that was his true art. Hannah shared this instinct. She was striking, bold, and unapologetically adventurous, her presence enough to command attention in any room. Together they were intoxicating to those around them, a glamorous couple, European in their sophistication, liberated in their attitudes, magnetic in their confidence. Their apartment was a magnet for curiosity seekers, intellectuals, and those drawn to the allure of something just beyond the bounds of conventional respectability. It was in these intimate gatherings that their double lives blurred most dangerously. The Koechers did not merely attend parties, they curated experiences. Music, drinks, conversations that slid from politics into philosophy, from philosophy into intimacy. The air would thrum with possibility, with the scent of risk. They were swingers, not in secret, but in a manner that made it seem like part of their identity, an extension of their disdain for dullness, their hunger for novelty. To outsiders, it was eccentricity, maybe even decadence, but in 1970s America, where countercultural freedom still pulsed in certain circles, it could be passed off as nothing more than an unusual lifestyle choice. For Karl and Hannah, however, it was much more. It was both cover and compulsion. A way to live dangerously without ever seeming like danger was the point. Karl's colleagues at the CIA knew little of this world. In the sterile halls of Langley, he was the serious émigré intellectual, the man who had traded the gray oppression of socialism for the bright lights of American opportunity. But beyond the office walls, in clubs and apartments, in whispered conversations and clandestine encounters, Karl and Hannah spun a parallel existence. It was here that the line between personal indulgence and professional risk blurred fatally. Among the laughter and the seduction, secrets slipped, sometimes in jest, sometimes in drunken confidences, sometimes in the calculated probing of a man who knew how to ask questions without seeming to. For Karl, these nights were not merely pleasure. They were reconnaissance. Every lover, every confidant, every friend drawn into their orbit was a potential source of information, or at least a character in the broader drama he staged. He observed what people revealed when they thought themselves free of consequence, how desire loosened tongues, how status and ambition could be teased into vulnerability. Even if the conversations yielded little of direct intelligence value, they gave Karl a deeper sense of the American psyche, the cracks in its self-confidence, the hypocrisies beneath its rhetoric. These insights, filtered through his reports to Prague, were as important in their way as the cables and memos he smuggled out of Langley. But indulgence is never without consequence. The more flamboyant Karl and Hannah became, the more eyes turned toward him to report them. In Washington, even in its fringe subcultures, reputations traveled fast. The Koechers were whispered about, not maliciously at first, but curiously. Who were they really? Why were they so brazen in a city where discretion was currency? Why did they seem to revel in a kind of European libertinism that Americans only half understood? For Karl, this attention was exhilarating. To be the subject of rumor was to be in control of the narrative. Yet, with every rumor, the possibility of a thread unraveling his carefully woven cover grew stronger. Inside Karl himself, a more dangerous transformation was taking place. He was beginning to believe in his own invincibility. The years of deception, the constant victories, the absence of consequences, they had all combined to convince him that he was untouchable. He walked through Langley with quiet superiority, a man who knew that while his colleagues saw themselves as guardians of national security, he was the one who truly held the cards. When he returned home to Hannah and the life they built together, he indulged that superiority in pleasures that reinforced the idea that he lived above the rules. He was not bound by the dull morality of the people he deceived. He was beyond it. And yet, for all his confidence, paranoia crept in. No spy, no matter how skilled, is immune to the gnawing thought that somewhere, someone has noticed. Karl began to watch his colleagues more carefully. Did that glance linger a moment too long? Was that casual question really casual? Were his reports being checked more closely? He masked these fears with bravado, but they gnawed at him in quiet moments. He would confide to Hannah his frustrations, his suspicions, but even then he wrapped them in a tone of superiority, as though suspicion itself was a sign of his brilliance. He told himself he could outwit anyone, that if the Americans ever grew doubtful, he would simply manipulate them as he always had. The paranoia extended into their social life as well. Swinging and seduction were intoxicating, but they carried risk. What if someone they welcomed into their home was more than they appeared to be? What if a careless word reached the wrong ear? Karl reassured himself that no one could connect the dots, that the wild European couple was too far removed from the buttoned-down corridors of intelligence to be taken seriously as a threat. Still, at odd hours the thought crept in. Masks, no matter how well worn, could slip. The CIA itself was entering a period of self-doubt. The mid-1970s brought revelations of past abuses, congressional investigations, and an atmosphere of suspicion within and around the agency. It was a dangerous time for a mole because the culture of unquestioning trust was cracking. New oversight meant new scrutiny, and Karl could feel it. The whispers about his politics, his arrogance, his lifestyle, they were faint, but they were there. Counterintelligence officers were paid to notice such things, and Karl knew it. The question was whether his performance could keep them at bay, or whether the momentum of suspicion was building too quickly to escape. Hannah, for her part, thrived in the drama. She played the role of the sophisticated wife with ease, her beauty and charm opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed. She believed in Karl, not because of ideology, but because of their shared hunger for excitement and control. To her, espionage was not a cause, but an adventure, and she embraced the risks as part of the thrill. Yet even she sometimes wondered whether Karl's arrogance might go too far, whether the mask he wore at Langley could withstand the weight of the double life they had built so brazenly. Their handlers in Prague monitored the situation with a mix of awe and unease. The reports Karl sent were invaluable, but his flamboyance made them nervous. A spy is most useful when invisible, and Karl was anything but. Still, his access was too valuable to cut off. They reassured him, encouraged him, but quietly they began to consider contingencies. If Karl's cover ever faltered, he could become a liability, and in the world of intelligence, liabilities were not tolerated for long. The double lives of Karl and Hannah Koecher, CIA insiders by day, libertine provocateurs by night, were as exhilarating as they were unsustainable. The tension between their two worlds was tightening, invisible at first, but growing stronger with each passing month. Karl's arrogance told him he could maintain the balance indefinitely. His paranoia whispered otherwise, and somewhere, within the labyrinth of American counterintelligence, men and women trained to see through masks were beginning to notice that something about Karl Koecher did not quite fit. He did not yet know it, but the Playboy life he flaunted so openly was not merely a sideshow to his espionage. It was becoming the very thread that investigators would tug on, the paradox that would make them ask the most dangerous question a spy can face. Who is he, really? Karl Koecher moved through Washington with the same elegant calm he had always worn, but the invisible air around him had shifted. The laughter that once carried easily through the salons and dinner parties now carried undertones, glances that lingered too long, questions that seemed casually phrased but landed with precision. In the very circles he had cultivated, academics, analysts, swingers, bureaucrats, men and women eager to confide in someone who seemed always curious, always charming, he began to sense something different. It was not yet accusation, not yet exposure. It was the invisible current of suspicion, that subtle ripple when others are beginning to look closer. In the world of espionage, suspicion is a death sentence drawn out over time, and Karl knew better than most how it felt to live under its shadow. For years he had been feeding Prague with secrets few agents in the Cold War could dream of accessing. Inside the CIA's language division, inside the inner circles of analysts who passed reports upward to the policymakers, he had touched the lifeblood of American intelligence. He had read, memorized, translated, and whispered back across the Atlantic the words that described Soviet troop movements, nuclear strategy, clandestine meetings, and the fragile alliances that bound the Western Bloc together. And yet, the very access that gave him power was also the thread that could unravel him. The CIA was never a place of trust. It was a hall of mirrors, and even the most loyal analysts feared that their colleagues might be double-faced. Karl had slipped in by blending intellect with seduction, cynicism with charm, but as the 1970s edged toward the 1980s, the CIA was turning inward, hunting its own shadows. The FBI had begun to watch him. They did not burst into his home or confront him with evidence. That was never their way. They circled first, quietly. They pulled at threads, bank accounts, travel records, acquaintances. They listened to whispers from defectors, from others who had crossed from east to west with stories of moles planted deep inside American intelligence. In the paranoia of the Cold War, any irregularity could be magnified into a threat. Yet Karl's irregularities were not trivial. He lived beyond his means, drifting through an extravagant social life with his wife, Hannah, attending swinger parties in the wealthy suburbs of Virginia and New York, cultivating a reputation that some found thrilling and others found reckless. The parties gave him cover, intimacy disguised as hedonism, but they also made him conspicuous. A man who seemed too curious, who asked too many questions, who remembered too much from one pillow talk conversation to another, could not remain invisible forever. Karl felt the tightening not through evidence, but through intuition. Spies live by instinct, and his told him that eyes were on him. Cars idled too long near his home. A man on the metro looked away too quickly when their eyes met. A phone call clicked once, faintly, as though a line had been tapped. It was not paranoia alone. The FBI's counterintelligence team had in fact begun to wiretap, to follow, to test his routines. Surveillance is not sudden. It seeps into the fabric of a target's life. One night, a waiter at a restaurant seemed unusually attentive, perhaps wired with a microphone. Another day, a neighbor mentioned noticing men in suits waiting in a parked car. For most, these would be coincidences. For Karl, each detail was a pulse of danger, proof that his double life was no longer safely hidden beneath the American dream he had woven for himself. Inside the CIA, suspicions began to coalesce not from any single betrayal, but from the sheer improbability of his trajectory. How had a Czechoslovak émigré, a man who arrived with little, ascended so quickly into sensitive positions? Why had his background been so difficult to verify, his early years so vague? Some analysts dismissed the concerns. Karl was brilliant, indispensable, his translations flawless, his insights unique. But others, those hardened by the memory of Kim Philby and the Cambridge spies, were less forgiving. They had seen charm-masked treachery before. They remembered how easily the British services had been deceived. America would not make the same mistake again, at least not willingly. The FBI and CIA were not always allies in such hunts. Their rivalry often obscured collaboration. Yet, when the faint outlines of Karl's duplicity began to surface, necessity forced them into uneasy alignment. The Bureau brought in their mole hunters, men who had studied defectors' testimonies, who knew the signatures of Eastern Bloc infiltration. They looked at Karl and saw patterns. A wife who seemed complicit, a lifestyle that seemed funded by more than government salaries, and subtle behaviors that matched descriptions of others trained in Prague's intelligence academies. The case was not conclusive, but it was enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. They wanted him under glass, his every move catalogued. Karl, for his part, responded with the poise of an actor who knows the stage is watched. He maintained the routine, projecting calm, never showing the cracks that widened inside. He still attended parties, still flirted, still spoke with the same soft confidence that had drawn so many into his orbit. But in private moments his mask slipped. He wondered whether Hannah noticed the tension in his voice, whether she too felt the eyes upon them. Hannah, always the loyal accomplice, told him to relax, to trust in their craft, in the years of deception that had carried them this far. Yet even she could not deny the sense that their world was shifting. In their bedroom, when the house was silent, they whispered about Prague, about the possibility that they might need to vanish, to burn the life they had built and start again in shadows elsewhere. The surveillance grew tighter. Microphones hidden in walls, agents following at distances, contacts pressured into revealing conversations. One by one, Karl's networks of casual intimacy began to fray. Those who had once confided in him grew more guarded, and some withdrew entirely. The swinger parties, once a playground of secrets, became tinged with unease. He could not know which couples might have been approached, who might now be speaking to the FBI. Every encounter became a risk, every kiss a possible betrayal. And yet, he had to continue, for to change his habits abruptly would be to reveal awareness. The cruel paradox of espionage is that when the net tightens, the spy must behave as though nothing is amiss. Suspicion feeds on fear, and Karl refused to give them that satisfaction. But deep within him fear gnawed. He had devoted himself to the cause not out of blind ideology, but out of calculation, disillusionment, and the thrill of power. Now that very calculation betrayed him. The KGB and his Czech handlers sent reassurances. Coded signals slipped through dead drops and shortwave frequencies. But reassurances meant little when men in suits lingered near his driveway. He wondered if Moscow and Prague understood the danger, or if they would cast him aside as expendable, another piece sacrificed in the grand game of Cold War chess. A spy's greatest terror is not capture by the enemy, but abandonment by his own. The CIA's counterintelligence division began to test him, feeding false pieces of information into his path, watching to see if they surfaced elsewhere. It was the classic mole trap: create a trail of breadcrumbs that only a spy would carry beyond the walls of Langley. Karl knew the techniques. He had studied them himself. When certain details appeared in reports he translated, when certain rumors reached his ears, he recognized the shape of the trap. But recognition was not always enough. In the fog of intelligence, truth and deception blur until even the most careful mind can falter. Karl found himself second-guessing every word, every file, every detail he touched. Was it real or bait? Meanwhile, the Bureau grew bolder. Agents shadowed him in closer proximity, knowing the psychological toll surveillance exacts. They wanted him to feel it, to sweat, to make a mistake. It was not only about gathering evidence, but about breaking him down, tightening the noose until his composure cracked. In quiet offices, reports piled up. Case officers debated strategies. Some pushed for immediate arrest, fearing that allowing him freedom risked further compromise. Others argued patience, that a greater spy network might be revealed if Karl was allowed to run. The debate mirrored the eternal struggle of counterintelligence. Strike too soon, and you catch one fish. Wait too long, and the entire pond may be poisoned. The 1980s brought a harsher climate. The Cold War was escalating again, tensions high, nuclear rhetoric sharp. Within such a climate, moles became the gravest of threats, and paranoia spread like wildfire. Karl's face appeared in secret briefings, his name whispered in corridors where careers rose and fell on suspicions alone. To some, he was already guilty. To others, still a mystery. But to the men and women trailing him, cataloging his life, the answer seemed clear. He was compromised, and sooner or later, the mask would fall. Karl sensed the inevitability. He began to prepare in subtle ways, securing escape plans, rehearsing explanations, tightening his circle of trust until only Hannah remained within it. He played his part with perfection, yet In stolen moments he imagined the knock on the door, the cold voice announcing his arrest. He dreamed of interrogation rooms, of bright lights and endless questions, of betrayals spilling from lips he once trusted. Sometimes he dreamed of being traded, of standing on a bridge in Europe, walking past men with guarded faces into the arms of those who had sent him here. The thought was both comfort and curse, for such swaps were rare, and not all spies were deemed worthy of redemption. As the surveillance deepened, the world he had built cracked further. Washington, once a playground of opportunity, became a labyrinth of eyes and ears. Every step felt rehearsed, every word rehearsed, every gesture measured. The paranoia was not only his, it seeped into Hannah, into the walls of their home, into the very air they breathed. Together they maintained the facade, but the weight was crushing. They lived inside a play whose final act was approaching, though neither could yet see the curtain fall. And somewhere, in a sealed office, men in suits laid out the final steps. Reports were compiled, warrants drafted, strategies approved. The net was nearly closed. Karl Koecher, once the improbable émigré who had slipped into the CIA's heart, was now the quarry of two of the most relentless intelligence services in the world. His time was measured not in years, but in days and hours. He did not know when the end would come, only that it would. And in the quiet of those nights when sleep evaded him, he wondered whether history would remember him as a master spy who fooled America, or as a man undone by his own appetites, betrayed by the very world he had manipulated so well. The tension of his double life had reached its peak. The watchers drew closer, the walls pressed tighter, and Karl moved as though across a chessboard whose final moves had already been determined. Beyond the horizon waited interrogation, betrayal, perhaps even the strange mercy of a spy swap. But in these days, in this tightening net, he lived minute to minute, a man still free, yet already ensnared, his every breath echoing with the knowledge that the end was near. The days of watching were over. For months, the Bureau had tightened its grip, the CIA had fed breadcrumbs, and the whisper of suspicion had grown into certainty. Behind closed doors in Langley and in FBI field offices, the decision had been made. Karl Koecher, the émigré who had slipped like smoke through the cracks of America's defenses, would no longer walk unchallenged. The time had come to strike. Yet such strikes are never sudden. They are choreographed like theater, each move precise, each actor rehearsed. By the fall of 1984, Karl was living his ordinary, double-edged life, unaware that the script had already been written for him and the curtain was about to fall. The Bureau had watched him so long that they knew his habits better than he did. They knew the routes he took from his suburban home into the city, the restaurants where he favored a corner table, the delicately careless way he handled conversations with strangers at parties. They knew that his wife Hannah was always near, the two of them bound by a complicity that seemed to make them untouchable. And they knew, too, the psychological edge he carried, that faint arrogance that came with fooling the greatest intelligence power in the world for more than a decade. Arrogance, though, was often the lever that counterintelligence used best. The FBI chose to wait for the right moment, a moment where the arrest would be both undeniable and symbolic. Quiet surveillance alone was not enough. They needed to break him cleanly with evidence he could not explain away. That meant patience. They orchestrated controlled leaks, staged moments where Karl might betray himself, dangled hooks that only a spy would bite. Some he evaded, some he danced around, but each encounter convinced the watchers that he was operating with the instincts of the trained. By late 1984, the line between suspicion and knowledge was thin enough to cut. Karl sensed it. The shadows had been closer, the telephone clicks louder, the strangers at parties less discreet. He told himself he was imagining it, that paranoia was part of the life he had chosen. Yet in the stillness of the night, when Hannah's breathing was the only sound in their bedroom, he would stare at the ceiling and imagine the knock on the door. He could see it in his mind, men in suits, their voices cold, their hands firm. He had betrayed the country that had welcomed him, penetrated the heart of its intelligence, and for that he would pay. Yet another voice, equally insistent, told him that he was too valuable to lose. Prague and Moscow would never let him rot. If captured, he might be traded. Perhaps he would walk a bridge in Berlin, exchanging the cold stare of American agents for the cautious embrace of his handlers. The thought kept him balanced between dread and hope, a man both doomed and perhaps saved. The day came without announcement. It always does. The morning was gray, a thin mist crawling over the streets of New York, where Karl and Hannah had arranged to meet acquaintances. He was calm, his steps measured, his clothing impeccable as always. But as he approached the meeting, the bureau's net closed. Unmarked cars slid into position. Agents who had rehearsed their movements dozens of times stepped out with a precision that felt almost unreal. Before Karl could turn, before Hannah could speak, the words were there, sharp and final. FBI, you're under arrest. It was not violent. It rarely is when the prey has been stalked so long. The handcuffs were quick, the rights read in low, steady voices. Hannah's face was pale, her eyes darting not in shock, but in calculation. She had always known this was possible. Karl, ever the actor, managed a faint smile, as though amused that the play had at last reached this act. But inside, a cold dread sank into his bones. The daydream had become reality, and he was no longer the man who walked freely between worlds. He was a prisoner now, in the hands of the very country he had deceived. The interrogation rooms were everything he had imagined. White walls, harsh lights, voices that repeated questions until time itself seemed to collapse. The Bureau wanted not just his confession, but the map of his network, who he had met, what he had passed, where his loyalties truly lay. They played good cop and bad cop with equal mastery. One agent spoke of betrayal, of prison cells that swallowed decades, of disgrace. Another spoke of opportunity, of cooperation, of leniency if he admitted what they already knew. Karl, schooled in the art of deception, gave nothing. He had trained for this, rehearsed the discipline of silence, the calm of denial. To admit was to sign his death warrant in Prague's eyes. To deny was to test the patience of men who already knew. Hannah, too, was questioned. They believed she was not simply a wife, but an accomplice, her presence in their strange social circles more than coincidence. She met their stares with poise, her Czech accent curling around words that revealed nothing. Between them, husband and wife formed a wall, a partnership that had carried them through years of duplicity. Yet, walls can crack under pressure, and the Bureau's strategy was pressure itself. Long hours, repetition, subtle threats. They told Hannah they could separate her from Karl forever, that she would be alone if she did not cooperate. They told Karl that Hannah had already confessed, that his silence was meaningless. Lies upon lies, designed to break them. Still, Karl held his denials were polished, his explanations carefully crafted. He was a man wrongfully accused, a loyal immigrant whose lifestyle had been misinterpreted, whose eccentricities had been mistaken for espionage. He smiled faintly, spoke of misunderstandings, even played the role of the indignant intellectual. Yet, behind the mask, cracks formed. He knew the Bureau would not have moved unless they had something more than suspicion. Somewhere, some piece of evidence existed that tied him to Prague, to the Czech service, to the secrets he had passed. He imagined a courier caught, a message intercepted, a defector whispering his name. The uncertainty was worse than knowledge, for he could not fight what he could not see. The CIA followed the case with grim satisfaction. The mole they had suspected, the man who had slipped so easily into their midst, was finally in a cage. Yet, even within Langley there was no triumph, only unease. If Karl had been inside their walls so long, how much had he passed? How deep was the damage? Every report he had touched, every translation he had produced, was now a question mark. Analysts pored over files, wondering which secrets had crossed the ocean, which lives might be in danger because of him. Arrest did not close the wound. it revealed its depth. Meanwhile, in Prague and Moscow, messages crackled through secure channels. Their man had been taken. The Americans had him. Panic and calculation collided. To lose him was a blow, but perhaps he could be recovered. The Cold War had its rituals, and one of them was the spy swap. In back rooms of embassies, in coded cables, the whispers began. If the Americans would not bury him, perhaps they would trade him. The idea was not fantasy. Spies before had walked the bridges of Berlin, traded like pawns for men who had crossed the Iron Curtain in the opposite direction. The thought gave Karl a lifeline in his cell. He imagined the moment, the cold air, the careful steps, the exchange of bodies between two superpowers locked in eternal opposition. He clung to that vision, even as the Bureau pressed harder. The trial loomed, though its outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was enough, the suspicions confirmed. The American press whispered of betrayal, of a Czech-born man who had fooled the CIA. Headlines carried his name, his face, the word mole attached to him forever. He had sought anonymity, but now he was infamous. Hanna stood by him, a figure of icy loyalty, refusing to break even, as the weight of public scorn bore down on them both. The swinger parties, the whispers, the eccentricities that had once amused Washington now became damning details, painted as proof of moral corruption and duplicity. Karl watched it unfold with the detachment of a man who had lived too long in lies to care about truth. He denied still, yet inside he knew the play was ending. The Americans would not keep him forever, he told himself. He was too valuable, too symbolic. A man who had walked through the CIA's halls could not be left to rot unseen. He would be used, exchanged, bartered like the commodity he had always been. The only question was, when? As the winter of 1984 bled into 1985, rumors reached him through guarded words, hints dropped in corridors. A swap was possible. The FBI would not say it, the CIA would not confirm it, but he sensed it in their manner. They had caged him, but they had not destroyed him. He was no ordinary prisoner. He was a piece on the Cold War's grand board, and pieces like him were rarely sacrificed without calculation. And so Karl Koecher, the playboy who had penetrated the CIA, the émigré who had lived two lives at once, now sat in a cell, caught, but unbroken, waiting for the next act. He did not know the details yet, did not know whose freedom would balance his own, but he felt the faint stirrings of fate. His fall had come, sudden and public, yet perhaps it was not the end. Perhaps the end would come later, on a bridge in Berlin where the Cold War's silent ritual would grant him a strange redemption. For now he was trapped between past triumph and future uncertainty, a man exposed yet still dangerous, arrested yet not erased. The net had tightened, the mole had been caught, and the world waited to see whether America would keep its prize or trade it away. Karl Koecher sat in the sterile gray cell of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, staring at the ceiling as if it were a puzzle. His body was motionless, but his mind was a restless theater of calculations. He was a man who had spent a decade wearing disguises without changing clothes, living double lives without missing a heartbeat, seducing targets as if loyalty itself could be bought or rented. Now, all of that had compressed into the narrow confines of a prison cot and the cold awareness that the United States government held him, a declared traitor, a mole within the CIA who had danced too close to the fire. But even here, even under the weight of exposure, Karl believed there might still be an escape. Because for men like him, fate rarely came in straight lines. It came in deals, in whispers, in transactions made on shadowed bridges. From the moment of his arrest, Koecher had become a bargaining chip. A pawn, yes, but pawns in espionage had a way of being the most versatile pieces on the chessboard. American officials knew this, Soviet and Czechoslovak handlers knew it too, and Karl knew it best of all. He had cultivated his life around being indispensable, around containing secrets that could not be erased. Secrets about CIA operations, about sources, about how intelligence officers thought, behaved, and mistrusted. Even in prison, he carried value, and value was currency. The negotiations began almost invisibly. The Reagan administration, increasingly hawkish in its stance toward Moscow, was already playing the dangerous game of prisoner swaps, public spectacles that doubled as propaganda battles. Each side presented its operatives like trophies, proof that their adversary had blinked, that their agents were worth rescuing. In Washington's eyes, Koecher's betrayal was a scar. In Prague and Moscow's eyes, his return would be a triumph, an assurance that loyalty, however twisted, would not be left to rot. Behind the concrete walls of Washington conference rooms, intelligence chiefs and diplomats began to sketch possibilities. The Soviets had Anatoly Sharansky, a dissident imprisoned on trumped-up charges of espionage, who had become a rallying cry for the West. They also held Nicholas Danilov, an American journalist accused of spying. Each name was a piece in a larger puzzle, a board of human lives exchanged not for justice, but for leverage. Somewhere among these names, Karl Koecher's surfaced. He was not as public as Sharansky. He did not have the press clippings of Danilov, but he had something else, the rare stain of having penetrated the CIA from within. He was worth something, too much to ignore. For Koecher, the wait was psychological torture disguised as routine. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. He lifted weights in the small yard, rehearsing calmness, while inside he spun fantasies of freedom. He traded books with other inmates, analyzing their gestures like an anthropologist. Sometimes he imagined himself already back in Prague, seated at a cafe with Hanna, his wife, recounting this ordeal as if it had been just another chapter in their shared playbook. Other times, darker visions intruded, visions of being abandoned, left to decay in an American cell as his Czech handlers washed their hands of him. Betrayal, after all, was the true language of espionage. But as rumors of a potential spy exchange trickled into his ears, through lawyers, through whispers from guards who had read headlines, Karl adjusted his mask. He became patient. He performed indifference. He understood that his captors wanted him restless, wanted him to beg. Instead, he played aloof, the man who still had more secrets than they knew. His silence was itself a bargaining chip. The stage for these exchanges had long been set in Europe, on places that felt like film sets more than geography. Bridges across the Iron Curtain, isolated, fog-draped, surrounded by armed men who stared at one another through binoculars as if glimpsing ghosts. The most famous was the Glienicke Bridge, connecting West Berlin to Potsdam in East Germany. To the casual passerby, it was just another steel span over water. To the intelligence world, it was a theater of shadows where the Cold War became flesh, where men and women who had lived in lies walked back into the embrace of the nations that had lied for them. As negotiations solidified, whispers confirmed that Glienicke would again become the stage. For Koecher, it was almost poetic. A man who had infiltrated the heart of American intelligence would now walk that bridge, embodying the trade-off of secrets for flesh. The irony was not lost on him, nor was the danger, because these exchanges, while choreographed, carried an undertone of menace. What if the swap collapsed? What if shots rang out? What if, at the last moment, one side reneged? For a spy, even the act of walking to freedom could be lethal. Meanwhile, the American side rehearsed its message. To them, Koecher was a traitor they were willing to discard, not because they had forgotten his crimes, but because his return could purchase the release of men and women whose voices embarrassed the Soviets on the global stage. They wanted to rescue dissidents, to parade them before cameras, to show that Western freedom had triumphed over Eastern repression. To do so, they would hand back a man whose name could not be erased from CIA corridors, a mole whose shadow still lingered. The day approached with the inevitability of a slow drumbeat. Guards entered Koecher's cell with instructions. He would be transferred. He would be flown. No explanations, no details, just motion. The journey itself was designed to keep him off balance, to ensure that even as he became part of a deal, he would not control it. Shackled, moved under heavy escort, he felt the machinery of states grind around him. He was both cargo and symbol. Hana was included in the arrangement. She, too, would cross, her loyalty rewarded, her complicity acknowledged. They had built this life together, constructed masks together, played their games in Washington salons together. Now, they would step into history together. For Karl, this was perhaps the one sliver of victory, that espionage, for all its betrayals, had not severed them. Their double life had been not just survival, but partnership. When the aircraft carrying them descended into the gray air of Berlin, Karl peered out through the window, catching glimpses of a divided city that still pulsed with the contradictions of the Cold War. Walls, watchtowers, barbed wire, a city sliced open, bleeding ideology. This was the place where identities were swapped like poker chips, where spies became symbols in an eternal propaganda war. On the morning of the exchange, the Glienicke Bridge lay cloaked in mist. Soldiers took positions at both ends, weapons at the ready, but fingers steady. Convoys arrived from opposite directions, cars black as coffins, their engines purring like beasts held on leashes. Officials emerged, their faces masks of stoicism. The choreography was precise, measured in steps and seconds. This was no place for improvisation. This was theater, and theater required discipline. Karl stepped out, flanked by escorts. He inhaled the damp Berlin air and felt, for the first time in years, the electric current of anticipation that had once defined his work. Across the span, figures approached. Among them, Sharansky, who would be paraded before Western cameras as proof that freedom had a pulse. Karl envied him in a way, envied his clarity of purpose, his role as a moral symbol. Karl himself was something else, a weapon being returned to its maker, a shadow slinking back into the darkness. The walk across the bridge was brief but eternal. Each footstep echoed like a verdict. He could see Hana ahead, her posture straight, her eyes locked on him. They would leave together. Behind them, the United States would exhale, rid of a traitor. Ahead of them, Prague would inhale, welcoming back its mole. When the two groups met at the midpoint, the choreography unfolded without words. Papers exchanged hands, nods were given. The prisoners crossed in opposite directions, lives trading places in the fog. The moment was fragile, suspended between gun barrels and political calculations. Then it was done. Karl Koecher was on the eastern side, free, or at least freed into the embrace of those who had once sent him westward with instructions and expectations. For the Americans, the spectacle was a victory. Cameras captured Sharansky stepping into the West, into headlines, into history. Karl Koecher, in contrast, disappeared almost immediately into the folds of the Eastern Bloc, swallowed by the very shadows he had once served. His return would not be paraded. His story was not one of freedom, but of treachery. His name would not become a rallying cry. Instead, it would be filed back into the secret archives of Prague and Moscow, a tool returned, perhaps still useful, perhaps not. Yet for Karl, the bridge was not just an end. It was a confirmation that his life's gamble had in some way worked. He had been caught, yes. He had been exposed, yes, but he had not been discarded. He had been wanted, valuable enough to be traded, valuable enough to be saved. In the strange arithmetic of espionage, that was survival. As he and Hana drove away, escorted into the east, Karl glanced back once at the bridge, now retreating into the fog. He knew his story was not over. He knew that suspicion would follow him, that his handlers would wonder if he had given too much away in American custody. He knew that whispers of betrayal would haunt him in Prague as much as they had in Washington. But he also knew one thing. He had crossed back. He had walked the bridge of ghosts and emerged alive. The Cold War would move on, swallowing new names, staging new exchanges, weaving new betrayals. But the image of Karl Koecher, the Czech playboy who had infiltrated the CIA, crossing the Glienicke Bridge, would linger as one of those rare cinematic moments when espionage became visible, when the secret war briefly stepped into daylight. And in that moment, Karl Koecher was exactly what he had always claimed to be. Not a loyal soldier, not a patriot, not even a husband, but a survivor, a man who had built his life on lies and managed, somehow, to walk free. Karl Koecher stepped off the transport plane onto the cold tarmac of Prague, Hanna at his side, the city stretching around them like a stage set for a life he had once left behind. The air smelled of damp concrete and autumn decay, familiar yet alien, as if the city had shifted while he was away. In the distance, the silhouette of the Vltava River glimmered under a gray sky, its dark water reflecting the heavy clouds above. For Karl, it should have been a homecoming, a return to certainty. Instead, it was a cage gilded in memory, every familiar street, a corridor lined with ghosts of past loyalties and present suspicion. Prague was itself a testament to the contradictions of the Cold War. Old architecture scarred by political ideology, street lamps casting shadows over cobblestones where history had been written and rewritten. The city seemed to watch him, as if recognizing that he had crossed the Atlantic, penetrated the heart of the CIA, and returned. For Karl, every glance from a passer-by, every pedestrian who seemed too interested, carried the weight of meaning. He had been a master of observation. Now he felt it turned inward. Who was watching him? Who was speaking in code in the cafes, in the offices, in the corridors of the Ministry of Interior? Every step was measured, every word carefully chosen, every movement rehearsed. Because freedom in Prague was not liberty, it was surveillance framed as hospitality. The reception was formal, almost bureaucratic. His handlers were waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. Pražský úřad, the Czech intelligence apparatus, greeted him with polite nods and subtle scrutiny. They spoke of logistics, of reports, of debriefings. On paper, Karl Koecher was a hero, a man who had returned from the belly of the American beast with invaluable knowledge. In practice, he was a liability, a living reminder of the risks that came with infiltration. His handlers needed him alive, but controllable. A mistake, a misstep, or a display of pride could undo him. Hanna, ever composed, remained his anchor. Her presence was both comfort and shield. She moved through the city with him, attending official meetings, helping him navigate the delicate social rituals that now dictated their lives. But Karl could see the strain in her movements, the tension in her posture, the fleeting glances she cast over her shoulder. They had survived the bridge, the arrest, the swap, but survival was never static. It was dynamic, a constant calculation of danger and opportunity. The first days in Prague were a blur of debriefings. Karl sat across from intelligence officers who did not ask questions out of curiosity. They asked to confirm, to measure, to map. They dissected his recollections of the CIA, the names he had encountered, the operational methods he had translated and observed. Each answer Karl gave was measured, precise, a balance between revelation and concealment. One false detail could cost him his life or render him irrelevant. The stakes were suffocating, but Karl had learned long ago to breathe under pressure. Still, paranoia began to creep into even the most routine tasks. In the apartment provided for them, he noticed the faint hum of electricity that suggested surveillance, the subtle rearrangement of furniture that implied someone had been inside. He began to check locks obsessively, to change routes, to vary routines in ways that would have seemed unnecessary to anyone else. Hanna mirrored his caution, yet even she could not eliminate the sense that every step outside the apartment might be watched. In Prague, freedom was a veneer. Control remained elsewhere. Karl's mind, once sharpened for deception, now turned inward, obsessing over every possible betrayal. Had the Americans planted agents to follow him back to Eastern Europe? Could defectors or double agents have tagged him during his captivity? Even among his colleagues in Czech intelligence, could he trust anyone? The paranoia was both a shield and a prison. He would scan rooms before entering, listen for echoes, examine faces for signs of duplicity. Every interaction became a negotiation of truth and fiction, and every gesture felt like a potential trap. Socially, life resumed in a shadowed form. Official gatherings, parties hosted by fellow intelligence officers, and informal dinners all became exercises in subtle signaling. Karl noticed the cautious distance of those who had once celebrated his daring, the careful phrasing of compliments that masked judgment. He was the mole returned, a man whose name carried both reverence and suspicion. Some envied him, some feared him, and some quietly despised the audacity of his survival. The pressure of expectation weighed heavily. Prague demanded that he deliver, that his information be actionable, that his insights into CIA operations be exploited fully. Each day, Karl translated reports, analyzed American methods, and advised on countermeasures, yet each task felt like a tightrope walk. One misstep, one misjudged emphasis, one accidental slip could unravel him, could remind his superiors that a decade of deception was still a liability. The line between competence and suspicion was razor thin. At night, when the city was quiet, Karl and Hanna would sit together in their apartment. Conversations were tentative, laced with unspoken anxieties. They spoke of memories, of shared jokes, of past operations in carefully coded language that would seem mundane to anyone else. Yet the silence between words carried weight. Karl had learned to read the unspoken as carefully as the spoken. He sensed that Hanna, too, felt the pressure, the shadow of eyes that never blinked. Their marriage was now as much about survival as it had ever been about intimacy. But paranoia was not solely external. Karl wrestled with guilt, with the realization that his life in the West, his indulgences, and his betrayals had consequences that stretched beyond him. Were their American sources compromised? Had his actions inadvertently endangered lives? Such thoughts gnawed at him, but he could not dwell on them too long, for the machinery of intelligence required function over emotion. Still, in those moments of introspection, Karl felt the human cost of espionage, the fragile line between mastery and ruin. Even as he adapted, Karl noticed the subtle pressures of loyalty testing. Assignments arrived suddenly, requests for travel, analysis, or contact with agents that were meant to gauge his reactions. Every move was assessed, every hesitation catalogued. Trust was scarce, and in espionage, scarcity is as potent as any weapon. Karl found himself anticipating tests before they arrived, a habit honed in Washington but sharpened now by a climate of perpetual surveillance. Each success was met with measured approval. Each error, however minor, was noted, discussed, remembered. The years passed in cycles of duty and tension. Prague, with all its familiarity, became a crucible. Karl's brilliance was respected, yet never celebrated openly. He was a man who had penetrated the CIA, a man whose name might never be fully erased from the annals of Western counterintelligence, yet a man whose freedom depended entirely on the whim of those who had once trained and now judged him. The psychological toll was relentless. Sleep was a rare commodity. Dreams were invaded by American faces, by surveillance shadows, by the faint echo of the Glienicke Bridge under fog. The past was never past. It lingered, persistent and exacting. Koecher's social interactions, once effortless in Washington, were now cautious performances. Colleagues greeted him with polite nods, their eyes revealing nothing, their words layered with double meanings. Even casual remarks became exercises in decoding intent. To misread a gesture, to trust too openly, could invite suspicion that might spiral into accusations of betrayal. Karl's every movement was a balance between revealing competence and concealing vulnerability, between proving loyalty and surviving judgment. In quiet moments, Karl reflected on the strange arithmetic of his life. He had been a spy in the West, a traitor by the standards of his adopted country, and now a valued asset in the East. His identity was perpetually negotiated, never fixed. He thought of the American agents who had tracked him, the FBI teams who had meticulously gathered evidence, the CIA officers who had once welcomed him as a colleague. He felt a mixture of defiance and awe, a recognition that he had played his hand perfectly enough to survive, yet never perfectly enough to be unconditionally trusted. Hannah remained the constant in this life of shadows. Their partnership, tested through arrest, interrogation, and swap, became the foundation of their new existence. Together, they navigated Prague's streets, attended obligatory social functions, and managed the relentless scrutiny of intelligence officers. Yet, even she could not fully alleviate the constant tension, the creeping anxiety that accompanied every meeting, every assignment, every whispered conversation. In this city, once familiar, freedom was conditional, and every day demanded vigilance. Karl's legacy was as paradoxical as his survival. To the west, he was a mole, a cautionary tale of how intelligence could be penetrated, a man whose life demonstrated both brilliance and audacity. To the east, he was a success, proof that training, patience, and cunning could produce results. Yet, within him, he felt only the ongoing burden of self-preservation, the relentless accounting of risk and trust, the perpetual tension of a life spent in performance. Time in Prague passed without incident, yet every day carried the weight of history. Karl navigated it with skill and vigilance, knowing that a single misstep could erase years of survival. His mind remained sharp, attuned to nuance, always considering the next move, always calculating who watched, who judged, and who might betray. He had crossed the bridge, survived exposure, and endured arrest. Now, in the city of his birth and return, he lived in the delicate balance between value and suspicion, freedom and constraint, mastery and paranoia. Even in the quietest hours, when the city slept under mist and lamplight, Karl understood that his life remained a spy's life in its purest form, every step measured, every word weighed, every relationship a potential thread to unravel. There would be no rest, no certainty, only survival in the shadowed corridors of power, and the knowledge that the bridges he had walked, literal and metaphorical, would continue to define the contours of his existence for the years ahead. Karl Koecher lived the rest of his life, not as a man entirely free, but as one trapped in the echo of his own legend. For decades after his walk across the Glienicke Bridge, his name remained an enigma, whispered in the corridors of Western intelligence, a scar inside the CIA's institutional memory. He was the playboy who had danced through Washington salons, the Czech émigré who had infiltrated Langley, the mole who had sold secrets for ideology, or maybe just for the thrill of surviving on lies. And yet, for all that notoriety, he became less visible as the years passed, fading into the shadows of Prague, where paranoia became his only companion. To the west, Koecher was never forgotten. CIA briefers invoked his name when lecturing recruits on the dangers of hubris, on the vulnerabilities of counterintelligence, on the seductive power of a mole who could look like anyone, smile like anyone, flirt like anyone. FBI training courses dissected his case, pointing out the small warnings missed, the subtle tells that hindsight illuminated but the present had overlooked. His story was weaponized as a lesson. It had happened once, and it could happen again. To the east, however, he was not celebrated. His handlers had rescued him, yes, but they did not drape him in medals or parade him before crowds. In the paranoid architecture of communist intelligence, a returned spy was as much a liability as an asset. What had he told the Americans? Had he cracked under interrogation? Was his silence real or rehearsed? Karl, who had once been prized for his penetration of the CIA, now found himself the subject of suspicion, of quiet investigations conducted by the very people who had once trained him. In the mirror of Prague's intelligence community, trust was always provisional. He and Hannah settled into a quieter existence. They were given accommodations, protection, a semblance of status, but their movements were never entirely free. Karl resumed analysis, provided consultancy on Western methods, and occasionally wrote reports meant to guide younger officers. Yet, his days of active espionage were behind him. He was valuable, but his value was declining, much like the Cold War itself, which by the 1980s was showing cracks in its ideological armor. The paranoia that had once been the lifeblood of two competing empires was slowly bleeding out, replaced by economic exhaustion and whispers of reform. For Karl, though, paranoia never left. It had become the rhythm of his existence. In restaurants, he sat with his back to walls. On Prague's streets, he tracked reflections in shop windows, gauging who lingered too long. Even when walking with Hanna, he lowered his voice, as if the air itself carried microphones. Perhaps some of it was justified. The state did surveil him. But some of it was born of habit, a residue of years spent manipulating and evading, lying and surviving. He could not stop performing. He could not stop calculating. Even in supposed retirement, he lived as if the world were a chessboard and every pawn might conceal a blade. By the late 1980s, as communism began to unravel across Eastern Europe, Karl's survival took on a new dimension. The Velvet Revolution in Prague, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, all of these seismic events transformed the landscape of espionage. Old loyalties evaporated, agencies rebranded, files were opened, secrets spilled. Men who had once lived untouchable in the shadows found their names splashed across newspapers or condemned in tribunals. Karl, however, managed once again to navigate the chaos. He stayed quiet, letting others draw attention. His name, infamous but obscure, was resurrected in Western media, but in Prague he simply endured, a man who had walked through the Cold War and emerged into a new world order that seemed almost alien to him. The CIA and FBI revisited his case during these years, not with the urgency of active pursuit, but with the detached curiosity of archivists reconstructing the past. Declassified documents revealed pieces of his betrayal, redacted lines filled with speculation about the damage he had done. Analysts argued over how much he had truly compromised. Had he provided Moscow with anything critical, or had his value been inflated by the drama of his infiltration? Some argued that his psychological profile, the playboy, the swinger, the intellectual chameleon, had distracted from the fact that much of his reporting was less devastating than feared. Others countered that even his insights into CIA culture, the way officers thought, the vulnerabilities in their social lives, were as valuable as raw intelligence. In truth, the answer lay somewhere between. Karl had not been the most dangerous mole in history, but he had been a reminder that even the most guarded institutions could be breached. Hanna remained his partner through it all, a figure as enigmatic as Karl himself. Some believed she was the true stabilizer, the co-conspirator who ensured that Karl's double life never unraveled completely. Others suspected she had been the silent manipulator, the anchor that kept him bound to Prague's cause when his own loyalties wavered. To Karl, she was simply the one constant, the companion who had shared in the risks and in the rewards, who had endured arrest, exile, and the cold terror of the bridge. They grew older together, their bond hardened not by romance, but by survival. In his twilight years, Karl reflected more openly on his life, sometimes in interviews, sometimes in quiet conversations with those who sought him out. His voice carried neither apology nor triumph. Instead, it carried the detached perspective of a man who had played a dangerous game and refused to be defined by morality. "Everyone spies," he once said. "Nations, corporations, people on their neighbors. It is the oldest profession, only with better tools." To him, espionage was not treachery or patriotism. It was survival through performance, through adaptation. He never expressed regret for betraying the United States, nor did he profess deep loyalty to Prague. He had belonged to the game itself, to the thrill of deception. Yet the paranoia never left. Even as an old man, Karl Koecher lived as if someone, somewhere, might still be watching. He adjusted blinds, shifted furniture, burned papers he no longer needed. He treated every knock at the door with caution, every phone call with suspicion. Perhaps it was justified, perhaps it was delusion, but for a man who had built his life on lies, it was the only way to live. His survival had always depended on assuming betrayal was inevitable. For the intelligence world, Karl's story lingered like smoke. The CIA cited him as evidence of vulnerability, a warning that ideological loyalty could not be assumed, that background checks were never perfect. For the Czechoslovak and Soviet services, he was both a success and a warning, proof that infiltration was possible, but also proof of the instability it bred. For historians, he became a case study, not just in espionage, but in psychology, the intersection of narcissism, cunning, and performance. When Karl Koecher finally faded from public attention, he left behind not a clear legacy, but a paradox. He had been a traitor and a survivor, a mole and a symbol, a man both celebrated and distrusted by the sides he served. His life demonstrated the strange mathematics of espionage, that loyalty is negotiable, that truth is malleable, that survival often comes at the cost of certainty. He had walked into the CIA and walked out across a fog-draped bridge, leaving behind a trail of suspicion that would never fully close. Even in the final years, when age slowed his body but not his mind, Karl remained in character. He played chess in Prague cafes, eyes darting from board to doorway, scanning faces as if each stranger might be a tale. He smiled at young admirers who sought him out, answering questions with riddles, never giving more than he wished. His life had become legend, and legends, after all, survive best when they are only half understood. The Cold War ended, the walls fell, the empires collapsed. Yet Karl Koecher lived on as a shadow, a reminder that espionage was never about ideology alone. It was about survival, about the masks people wear, about the lies that outlast even the truths of nations. His twilight years were not peaceful, not serene. They were haunted, vigilant, a life lived always on guard. But they were his, and he had walked through history's darkest corridors and emerged breathing. For Karl, that was victory enough. And so the story of Karl Koecher does not close with a triumphant moral, nor with the clarity of judgment. It ends as it lived, ambiguous, suspenseful, unresolved. He was the Playboy in the CIA, the Czech who smiled across American dinner tables while reporting back to Prague, the traitor who became a bargaining chip on a foggy bridge, the survivor who grew old under the watchful eyes of ghosts. His story remains less about what he did than about what he represented, the fragile line between trust and betrayal, between freedom and control, between living a life and performing one. In the end, Karl Koecher became not a man of one nation or another, but a man of shadows. And shadows, once cast, never truly disappear. And so, as we conclude this long exploration together, let your thoughts drift gently. You have walked through shadows and histories, through whispers and revelations. Now, allow the story to settle, like soft mist over still water. The world of espionage continues, but for tonight, you may rest, knowing you have glimpsed the contours of a hidden world. Close your eyes now, and let the story fade into stillness. You have traveled through history, walked among hidden places, and listened to echoes from the past. But here, in this quiet moment, there is no need to hold on to every detail. You may simply let them drift away, like leaves carried gently down a stream. What matters most is not the facts themselves, but the calm you carry with you. The steady rhythm of time reminds us that all things, empires, secrets, even mysteries, rise and fall, leaving only the soft traces of memory. Tonight, you have been part of that rhythm, and now it is time to rest within it. So, take a slow breath in, and let it out even more slowly. Imagine the world growing quieter around you, as if the lights are dimming one by one, until only the comfort of stillness remains. Here, in this silence, you are safe. You are at rest, and the stories of the world will keep turning while you sleep. This has been Chronicles of Sleep. Thank you for joining this journey. May your dreams be gentle, your night peaceful, and your tomorrow bright. Good night.